Okay, Calvin Catstein, we're at the Peru Community Church. It's February 21st, 2019. Spring is just around the corner, right?
Oh yeah, that's the rumor, right? Good luck with that.
I'm not sure if Puxatawny Phil was 100% correct this year, but he did his best. And we're here for a speech, and people are starting to gather here. The Clinton County Historical Association is putting this on. And they got this venue here because the crowd's going to be so large it would overwhelm the museum in Plattsburgh, so they came up here to the Peru Community Church.
I thought it was more about the winter.
This is our story.
Okay, all right.
That's what we're going to tell them.
Okay.
Because there's a huge crowd that's
Yeah,
coming
all
here
right, gotcha.
Okay, and this fellow here is going to talk, Peter Slocum.
That's right.
All right. I'd like to know a little bit about you before we get into this, Peter. Where are you from originally?
Originally Troy, New York, down along the Hudson River, and grew up mostly
next door to Albany.
There you go. I grew up mostly in upstate, in the Albany, Troy area. Now live in Keene, and so I'm across the border in Essex County. But they invited me here regardless. So
okay, so you're not a Clinton County. You're an Essex County man right now.
My mom spent time in Clinton County, not far from the Historical Association Museum, as a social worker at the end of World War II.
Oh.
Helping for flyers to readjust after being in war zones.
Okay, so that was at
the air base.
The Champlain College area there.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so a few years back you became part of the Underground. What is it? What's the official Underground Railroad name here? I don't want to get it wrong.
It's the North Star Underground Railroad Museum, which is down in Osable Chasm, and run by the North Country Underground Railroad Historical Association.
And it all started by
Don and Vivian Papson. That's right. Yeah. And it's really sort of guided me on, or got me started certainly on a lot of this interest and then research on the topics we're going to be talking about tonight.
So until that time, were you much aware of the Underground Railroad and its activities through?
No, not at all. I was came up here with my wife, whose family was here, and I was a hiker. That was my main interest in the Adirondacks, and I gradually learned about John Brown's presence over there near Lake Placid, and then through that got an interest in the Underground Railroad Museum and started volunteering there and learning as much as I could.
Yeah, it's just an interesting story, and you know, there's always new chapters, it seems. They're always uncovering more and more about the Underground Railroad.
That's right.
And for some person out there who says, what is an Underground Railroad? Is that a subway? What is the Underground Railroad?
It's America's first civil rights movement is the way I like to describe it, because it was a combination of people, black and white, who helped other people escape from slavery, primarily in the South, or from the South, and would come to the North where slavery was abolished in 1827 in New York, somewhat earlier in other places, Vermont from the very beginning of its statehood. But anyway, people would stay here, sometimes try to live and make a life here, and quite a few people, free blacks, former slaves, did live in Plattsburgh and the immediate areas. Others went immediately to Canada because they felt they would be freer, or their freedom would be more assured there, especially after 1837 or so. So the network, the network of people helping these fugitives consisted of regular people, sometimes church members, sometimes farmers, sometimes carpenters who helped, who were able to assist people, sometimes by wagon, sometimes by foot, horseback, boats along Lake Champlain was an obvious route for people to get to Canada. To hide them during the day sometimes, and then travel by night. There are all kinds of stories less than 2 miles from here of the Keys and Smith families down by Northern Orchards. That was an Underground Railroad center down there, in effect, where people were hidden and then taken from there. And obviously it's not very far to get to Canada from there.
Right. So you say slavery was outlawed in New York in what year?
1827.
1827. But if you had an escaped slave, they could still come and get them, right?
Correct.
So even though there was no slavery here, if you were a slave and you escaped...
you could be subject to capture and taken back. And there are a whole bunch of cases, not around here, and it may be that the population was so sympathetic to the escapees that no one dared try anything around here. But in Boston and Syracuse and Troy, there are very famous cases of people who had lived for over a decade in peaceful harmony in their community, somebody came and grabbed them, said that you belong back to South Carolina or whatever, and sometimes they would take it back, sometimes they successfully fought off that capture with help from local people.
But they also have to be looking over their shoulder.
That's right, exactly. And of course there was, during an earlier period of New York's colony period and Massachusetts and others, a very active and prosperous slave economy here too. The people in the Dutch who settled New Netherlands, what became New York City, were importing slaves almost as soon as the planters in Jamestown, Virginia were importing slaves. Massachusetts had the first statute passed to legalize slavery in any of the English colonies in this part of the world. And it's something I didn't know until a month ago.
They brag about the Pilgrims, but they forget to mention that one.
That's right, exactly. Part of the Pilgrim legacy, yes, indeed.
And you say Vermont was right from the start of their statehood. But prior to their statehood, I know, I just recently looked at a census from 1790, and in 1790, New York claimed the western part of Vermont, and the Republic of Vermont was claiming.
Right.
So Vermont did a census of particularly Alberg and Isle-of-Mont, and New York did a census and included Alberg and Isle-of-Mont in my hometown of Champlain.
Yeah.
So both entities did a census, but according to that census, there were 2 slaves, and they were both on the Vermont side. So
oh, is that right?
That was,
okay.
But that was in 1790 before it became a state.
Right. Well, I think, isn't it 1777 is the date they adopted the Constitution, first Constitution in Vermont, but I'm not sure when they became a state.
Yeah.
But the Constitution prohibits slavery, but there is evidence, and yours confirms it again, that there were slaves indeed held there. And then there were obviously Underground Railroad depots along there in North Ferrisburg, the famous one where the Rokeby Farm Museum is now.
Okay, and your talk tonight is going to be specifically on what subject, Pete?
On the facts of northern slavery, essentially.
So it's not the Underground Railroad, it's slavery?
Correct. I mean, the Underground Railroad is part of it, but we wanted to focus on the facts of slavery in the North, which is sort of a little-told story.
Right.
And partly it's convenient for us Northerners to think, oh, that evil thing was just down there, and we saved the day, right? And we Union Army stopped all that. Well, in fact, we were having slaves here. Our ancestors were part of the slave machine as early as any Southerners were. And it died out for a bunch of different reasons here. The economy, population, the interest in the whole idea of revolutionary rights that were granted to every man and woman, not really.
Originally it was every man,
right,
every white man.
That's right, yeah. So that began to be inconsistent in many people's view with slavery. But slavery was an important part of building New York City into the economic engine that it was. The governors of early Massachusetts Bay colonies were enthusiastically supporting slaves first among Native Americans. They were actually prosecuting wars in part to get captives to use as slaves, some of whom they sold into the Caribbean to work on sugar plantations, some of whom they kept here to work on farms in what's now Massachusetts and Connecticut.
So just amazing when you try to think of what in some cases were otherwise decent people that had that kind of mentality. It's just mind-boggling that there could be that disconnect.
That was acceptable, right?
Yeah.
I know. And it's hard to put ourselves in that position, thankfully.
Yes. Right. All right. So anything else, Peter, that we should know about before you?
No, just that as you and I were talking before we started filming, there are always stories coming out, and what's fascinating about this topic tonight, Underground Railroad, other things, is that there's always more to learn, and the story is always more complex than we thought, than we learned in school, and it's important to understand how complex it is, and that we really have to keep turning over a page and looking to find the details that are hidden away someplace. Also, there are a tremendous number of resources available now, make it very easy to research some of these things, and I want to impress upon people tonight that you don't have to be a PhD in an ivory tower somewhere to do this kind of research.
Yes, certainly having the Underground Railroad Museum in our area has certainly enhanced people's interest in this topic, I think.
Right, and I think it's an inspiration for people everywhere in this area to think more and learn more about our history.
Yeah, I know in Champlain, on our in front of our church, St. Mary's Church, there's a plaque that was put up maybe 4 or 5 years ago for
Noadiah Moore.
Noadiah Moore.
There you go.
Lived right across the road, right across the street there. And so that plaque wouldn't have been there, I think, if there had not been an Underground Railroad Museum.
Yeah, that's right. I think you're right.
Yeah.
Which is great. So it improves our understanding of the whole area.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Very
Peter.
good. Thank you.
I'll be listening close.
Okay. All right. See you.
Peter Slocum.
I'm, I guess I'll get everybody seated. I'm Alan Nurska. I'm the director of the Clinton County Historical Association. And it's, hello? It's not on. Oh, you turned it off? Yeah. Okay. And I'm especially glad to be here because this is actually turns out to be the church that I was baptized in, confirmed in, and married in. So I mean, it's part of me. So I was really pleased. I'm always pleased when we have an opportunity to do an event here at this location. And the other thing I might say to you is if there's a donation box on the way out. The church gave us this facility for free. They usually charge for it. And they gave it to us for free for tonight's presentation. So if you like it, just put some money in the donation box on the way out. Thank you. The town of Peru, as if you don't know, you will know soon. It's known for its link to the Champlain line of the Underground Railroad. Peru split over slavery, and so this is a very fitting location for Peter's story. Peter is a volunteer guide, and he's a former board member of the North Star Underground Railroad Museum. He lives in Keene and chairs the Hurricane Mountain Friends, a volunteer group helping to restore and maintain the fire tower there. He's a retired newspaper reporter and then a public health advocate. Peter also volunteers with the North Country Health Heart Network, East Branch Friends of the Arts, and the Keene Historical Society. So we're very pleased to have him with us tonight, and I'll turn it over to Peter. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Helen, and the Historical Association for inviting me here today. And I agreed to do the talk not because I'm a great expert or a quasi-legitimate scholar or anything like that, but because I'm in my own period of continuing discovery, and I'm learning more and more about the complexities of our history, and I thought it would be legitimate to share some of the story about slavery in the North, factors that I didn't know very much about and I'm learning about all the time, and is, I think, important to understanding our own communities, our own culture, where we come from, and how we got here. I started the journey with the Underground Railroad Association coming under the influence of Don and Vivian Papson and Helen at the time working there, and learned an awful lot about the Underground Railroad and factors of hidden history, we like to call it, of the area, and I've learned more and more as I've gone on. So my interest has continued, and there are lots of holes in my knowledge, as I'm sure there are for all of us, but I thought I would take a stab at entertaining you with some stories. I want to talk about the questions of Northern slavery, both from the point of view of laws and data and continental movements and stuff, and also some individual stories of people who were part of that story, both enslaved people, slave owners, freed people, and so on. So, pardon me if I play over my notes as well as the slides here, and there we go. I can start by talking about a little bit the data, which is going to be on the first slide when we get to it, that is, shows that in 1790, in the northern states, what we think of the northern states, north of Maryland and Delaware, there were approximately 40,000 enslaved people, and there was not nearly as many as in the South, but still, New York itself had approximately 20,000 people enslaved at that time, and it was an important part of the New Amsterdam economy at that time. Remember, New Amsterdam was settled in the 1620s by the Dutch, and a little bit earlier was the English settlement in Jamestown, Virginia, and Massachusetts, of course, with the Pilgrim colonies in the 1620s as well. So all those things were happening at about the same time, and at about the same time, slavery was happening there too. It's really nice. There you go.
I'll just keep doing this unless that...
That'd be great. Good for me, that's good for you, right? Okay. So anyways, the 1790, there are varying degrees of accuracy with the various censuses that were taken in this time, but and there were inconsistencies and so on. But here you have a sense of the cluster around New York City. You can see the darker red there, which is the Dutch stronghold. And so the Dutch West India Company was importing slaves, from the very beginning practically. The concentration of slavery was up the Hudson River, you can see on the map, and a little bit down in New Jersey was also quite intensively involved. Combination of domestic tasks that slaves were asked to perform, or required to perform, not asked to perform, and some farming. But at this time, or I think it was 1800 or 1810, there were only 3 slave holders in the northern states who had 20 or more slaves in their possession, one of whom was in New York and Hudson Valley, Robert Livingston, who was just 2/3 of the way up the river from New York to Albany, and was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, another, right again, there we go. So, as I mentioned, Virginia had the distinction, shall we say, of the first official slave import as far as we know today, and in fact, 400 years ago, 1619 is the anniversary of the first official landing of imported slaves from Africa. This is going to come back in the news because of the current governor's difficulty with some racial issues when he was in college, as you may have read. So interestingly, that's sort of I think the national understanding of the official start of slavery. But in New York City, 375 years ago, this coming Monday, the governor of New York, or New Amsterdam, Kreft, his name was, a Dutch appointee, ruled on a petition from 8 enslaved Negroes who said that they had been already held in service for 18 or 19 years. This was supposed to be their term of servitude, and they were applying for freedom. And the governor, interestingly enough, granted them what they called half freedom at the time, which was the freedom to continue to work and live in that area, but they had to pay a certain amount of their wages to the government in order to continue to do that. And any offspring of their families would be continued to be held in slavery. So it was maybe not even half freedom. But anyway, it's interesting that by then, roughly 20 years from the time he gives that petition his blessing, there were people who were enslaved in New Amsterdam doing the work eventually of building the wall and many other things that became Wall Street. And there was a very active slave market in the area where South Street Seaport is on the East River. Many of you have probably been to that area, and I never knew that was a slave trading area at all. And Massachusetts has another anniversary a little bit later that I'll talk about a little bit. Okay, so let's go to New York specifically. This is an interesting image which was used by the Dutch West India Company to recruit settlers to come to New Amsterdam and up the Hudson River to help populate the farms or patronages that were being launched there. And you can see that this advertisement poster has a clear indication of African slaves available to do your work. If you come here and resettle, there are the slaves in the background doing it. This is a woman who looks to be of mulatto or mixed parentage. There's the fort in the background, down the battery of what is now the battery in New York City, and the Dutch official there. So this was part of what they were doing. And slaves, when they first came to New York City, were largely imported by the Dutch West India Company itself and owned by the Dutch West India Company, and then delegated to do certain functions, build fortifications, improve the ports, and other things. And then some slaves were actually held by individuals as well. This poster is used in a series of exhibits around New York State now by the New York State Parks and Recreation Department, which has created an exhibit on Dutch slavery with the help of a number of other research institutions. But I saw it at Fort Cralo in Rensselaer a couple of years ago. It's now at the Maybe Farm on the western edge of Schenectady, which is a very early Dutch farm, which had slaves there too, and I never knew that before. I never knew anything about the slavery history of Albany as I was growing up there. My wife, who grew up in Schenectady, never knew that the famous Indian massacre of 1690, among the victims were 11 enslaved Africans who were held in Schenectady and worked in that community. She missed that part of her history class if it was indeed offered to her. So that's one of the things that has driven my interest, is understanding more about that hidden history that we all share. Okay. Sojourner Truth, one of the more famous people who escaped from slavery. She was a famous speaker for women's rights and abolition after she was freed. She was not a Southern plantation slave. She was born outside of Kingston, New York, enslaved to a Dutch family named Hardenberg, and was first sold at the age of 9. And was sold to an English family, which abused her physically because she couldn't understand what they were telling her. She spoke Dutch. She was raised in a Dutch family as a slave, and she was then, when sold off to another family, they were very frustrated. She didn't understand what they were trying to tell her to do. She was sold again early in her life. In her early 20s, became enamored of a man, and they wanted to get married. He was enslaved on a nearby farm, not the same one she was on. And his owner forbade their union because he wanted to make sure that any progeny of their union would be owned by him, that owner, right? And if this man is going to go and hook up with Isabel Bumfree, her name was, then those children would be possessed by the other owner. Shows you the degree to which they were regarded as property, right? The resources. At one point, she was sold to another farmer for $100, and she and a herd of sheep were sold to another farmer for $100. So that was the level of humanity that she was granted. One of the stories we hear about, and appropriately enough, about Southern slavery and the life on Southern plantations, the brutality of separation of families, that the families were ripped apart when children were sold off to some other plantation far away, or sometimes, excuse me, a husband and wife were torn apart on purpose because they were causing trouble or whatever. It happened here too. Her 5-year-old son was sold to a slave owner in Alabama. And this is in the early 1800s. She was born in 1797. New York passed its
gradual emancipation law in 1799, which granted freedom, depending on the exact category, at about 1827. She'd been promised by her owner then, if she was a good worker, she would be freed early, but he reneged on the promise, of course. She then walked away from her farm and eventually escaped and was allowed to go, and was another farmer basically paid for her freedom the last couple of years. So anyway, the point I wanted to make is that the human degradation that we associate with the Southern slavery story was present here as well, even if the masses of people on the plantation weren't the same. Okay. So let's switch now to Massachusetts for a little bit. Interestingly, and the new partial knowledge for me within the last month, Massachusetts had the first law of any English colony legalizing slavery. Not Virginia, not South Carolina, not Maryland, Massachusetts. Why? Because they wanted to get workers to replace the indentured servants who'd come over in the first wave of immigration. Now were using up their indenture, and they were not going to stay around working for the person who brought them here. They were going to go out and try to start their own farm. So the colony was running out of cheap and free labor. So where's the source? It was handy Native Americans. So there were two successive wars. I'll get more into that in a little bit. But anyway, so they propagated this statute saying that people could be made slaves if they were captured in just wars, not unjust wars, just wars, and which was, of course, an old religious concept from Europe. We only prosecute just wars because we're the good guys in all our wars. Or if they were offered for sale by somebody else. So basically, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop and friends, could incorporate slaves into their world. And in fact, there's evidence that part of the reason for going to war was to create slave resources. And we'll talk more about that later. Another fact along the way for Massachusetts is that they have a very relatively quick evolution from first legalizing slavery and then beginning to roll back those rules. And in 1780, there was a petition by two brothers for voting rights. They actually had not been slaves, but they were free black men and denied voting rights, and they were being taxed by Massachusetts, but not allowed to vote. And then in 1783, as Massachusetts passed a new constitution, they actually abolished slavery altogether by virtue of a bunch of things. But anyway, let's go to the next slide. So here are those wars I mentioned, Pequot and King Philip's wars. The King Philip wars were particularly devastating. The pre-war population of the southern New England natives was around 5,000 by this point. Almost 3,000 of them were killed in the war, either from disease or direct warfare injuries. And of those remaining, half of them became slaves or servants to the English victors of the war. So you can see what a devastating effect that had on the New England population and what it meant for Native American relations and everything. There was a slave pen on islands in the Boston Harbor. Slaves were sold, Native Americans were sold into the Atlantic slave trade, sometimes in exchange for black slaves who were brought from Africa to the Caribbean, because the Native Americans were regarded as too likely to rebel. And so Massachusetts was trying to get rid of them because they were causing trouble, and they would trade them for the Africans who were in Barbados and other places working on sugar plantations. So here was an active slave trade that Massachusetts was participating in directly, selling people to the Caribbean in exchange for others and for goods and everything. And of course, both New York and Boston were centers of major commerce in the Atlantic slave trade during this time, not just with people, but with goods that were sold, and the slave plantations in the Caribbean were devoting so much of their resources to the cash crop of sugar and later tobacco and other things, they didn't have time to grow any food. So Massachusetts and New York produced the food to feed the plantations, and then took the sugar back and sold it and so on. The triangle trade, it's often called. Okay, so let's go, and sorry, back up 1 second, Helen, thank you. That's an engraving of the man, the Indian chief, whose name was, proper name is Metacom, and this was, but he was nicknamed King Philip, and he was a Wampanoag Native American in southern Massachusetts, Connecticut area, also Martha's Vineyard, and this engraving was done in 1772 by Paul Revere Jr., apparently. Okay, so we'll move on. Another part of the Massachusetts story, Paul Cuffy was the son of an enslaved man who was also, he also became a ship captain, and he was the fellow who was behind that petition I mentioned before for voting rights in Massachusetts. This is where the story gets very illuminating for me personally, in that he was the son of an enslaved man who had been enslaved by a direct ancestor of mine. It's a fact totally unknown to me until last year. A man named Slocum, who was a Quaker in the New Bedford area of Massachusetts, and he came bought this Paul's father. Paul's father was kidnapped from the coast of Africa, probably near Senegal, when he was 10, brought to the United States, I think directly, and purchased by this fellow Ebenezer Slocum, who then, 277 years ago today, sold him to a direct ancestor of mine named John Slocum. If you hit the next slide, you'll see part of the bill of sale, I think. Yes, and you can see, regrettably, my surname, and there's a slave named Cuffy. So that's a document that I found in New Bedford, Massachusetts, indicating that, in fact, they had been trading in slaves within my family. Switch back if you don't mind, Helen. Thanks. This guy, John Slocum, buys Paul's father in 1742, I guess it was, or no, 1745. Anyway, and then 3 years later decides to free him because they're all Quakers, and the Nantucket meeting of the Quaker Fellowship was the first one in that area to decide to come out against slavery. The same way other meetings in this area came out, and New York State came out against slavery at different times. They gradually expelled people from Hudson Valley meetings who refused to give up their slaves, for instance. So John Slocum decided that slavery was something he could no longer countenance. As a good Quaker, he frees this man who was named Cuffy Slocum, and that man goes to work for the Slocums on a farm and runs the farm and prospers as a free laborer. Marries a Wampanoag woman from Martha's Vineyard. They have 10 children, and one of whom is Paul Cuffy, who learns to sail at age 16. He's very good with boats. He starts bringing cargo from the mainland out to the islands, starts to make money, buys bigger boats, and a classic story. Obviously an incredibly talented and determined young man who was eventually running goods through the British blockade to help supply the revolutionary forces in Massachusetts and Connecticut in that area during the American Revolution. He then ends up on a whaling vessel, and he buys major ships. He's involved briefly with an effort to resettle free blacks in Africa again, and he actually, on his own dime, so to speak, takes a ship loaded with ex-slaves back to Liberia and tries to help start a colony there. It didn't work, but he was involved in a lot of things. He started what may have been the first desegregated school in the United States, in Massachusetts. And he also brought that petition for voting rights, because he said, here you're in the middle of a constitutional fight with Great Britain. You're saying all men are created equal, no taxation without representation. I'm being taxed. You're not letting me vote for the representatives who are taxing me. His petition was denied, but within a couple of years, the Massachusetts legislature adopted new constitutional rules, which included the right to vote for free black men in Massachusetts. So once again, you see that as parallel with our Southern story, it's a total denial of rights. Even for freed people, you're not considered equal by any means. Okay, so another story. Then we've seen this already. Now we'll come back to New York for a look at William Gillibrand, who, as I'm sure everybody knows, was the early settler just south of the town of Plattsburgh, and had a number of large estates along the lake. And here in the 1770s, this is a portrait and an advertisement from the North Star Underground Railroad Museum in Osable Chasm. And in the advertisement to the right is an ad for a man named Ireland, a Negro man, who has run away from Gillibrand's farm and presumably gone off to Canada. The ad says that he believes that Ireland has been seduced by this other fellow who's not reliable and taken off to Montreal, and he's offering the $6 reward for the return. And this is in 1771, so you see here we are just before the revolution breaks out. Slavery was obviously a part of the economy in this area as well, and there's no evidence that Ireland ever returned or was found, but it's another example of the kind of factor of life of slavery which was very common throughout the whole North, of people searching for valuable property. Valuable in a different sense, this wonderful book we published a couple of years ago called In Defiance, and it's runaways from slavery in New York's Hudson River Valley. And it's full of ads like that, which describe people who have escaped from slavery, slaveholders of one kind or another. And there's a good translation of them, some additional information if the authors have it, but it's a great resource, and they've got the locations of the people plotted on a map here, they've got an index in the back of all kinds of things, and of course, this is where you learn about the reality of the individuals who were slaves, what languages they could speak, what talents they had as carpenters or bricklayers or iron workers, because they're all described in the ads. I want this person back because he can speak 3 languages and build a barn in no time, those kinds of things. And here's their value laid out very precisely in these ads. So again, evidence of the value of the slave economy to people in the North. Let's go to another slide, Helen, if you like. So here's an interesting parlay for post-slavery time. New York, I think I mentioned during the part about Sojourner Truth, New York had a gradual emancipation law passed at the end of the 18th century, and by 1827, roughly, everybody was supposed to be freed from slavery. But that didn't mean they were full citizens by any means. We had many people, of course, coming through this area, escaping from slavery in the South, trying to either find safe havens here or go up to Canada. And what was the attitude of New Yorkers about those people's rights? And the freed people who had been slaves or who somehow arrived here as free people. do they deserve full citizenship rights? Was abolitionism the same thing as equal rights? So the Constitution had not originally discriminated, the Constitution in New York had not originally discriminated against free blacks, but in 1821 the rule was changed and it said that free blacks had to have $250 worth of property in order to vote. Free whites did not. And of course, for years and years, decades, hundreds of years before, property rights had been linked to voting rights because rich people didn't want poor people messing things up. In an effort to change that, there was a referendum put on the ballot in 1846. Should black men have the same rights to vote without the property requirement as whites? Statewide, not even close. 30% voted yes, 70% voted no. I didn't have enough room to put the no, but you get the idea, right? These are all yes, this is all yes percentages here. But up here, in Clinton and Essex County, people voted in favor of having blacks and whites have equal voting rights. In 1860, the issue was on the ballot again. 1860, the year that Abraham Lincoln is elected president, New York State votes in favor of Abraham Lincoln. That year, only 40% of the people statewide think that it's a good idea. The numbers in favor up here start going down a little bit, not more than a little bit actually. 1869, after the Civil War, after New York has fought in this huge battle to end slavery, New York still doesn't agree that voting rights should be equal. Essex holds the same, Clinton about the same, Warren County dropping some more. So it wasn't until the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution that voting rights were equalized for men, white and black men. Of course, women were not part of this discussion at all, but I find this fascinating when you think about the debates that go on today about voter suppression and who's voting and why do we want some people to vote and not others. And what's fascinating also is a little tidbit, the reason the Constitution was changed in the 1820s was because the ruling party had been out of power for a long time, partly because black voters in New York City were voting for the other party. And then when, I think the Whig party, and then when the Democrats got into power, they said, okay, enough of that stuff, we're going to change the rules. And the number of blacks voting in a subsequent election in New York City was 16. So you can see that it was a very effective way to suppress the vote. Okay. This is just a stunning series of numbers to me. New book by a historian named Jill Lepore, who's written about the slave revolts in New York City, as a matter of fact. But this is a newly published book. It gives you some perspective about the settling of this continent, right? In 1500 and 1800, roughly 2.5 Europeans moved to the Americas. This includes South America, by the way. Carried 12 million Africans there by force, and as many as 50 million Native Americans died, chiefly of disease. So just think about those numbers. And what, number one, who was doing the work, right? And what it means in terms of populating and then making this continent a prosperous part of the world over that period. It's just okay. Yes?
I don't understand this. It says so over the period of 300 years, 2.5 million Europeans moved?
Came here, yes.
So, so I imagine their population increased over that time.
Absolutely, that's right.
Okay. And the 12 million Africans.
Their population increased also.
Yeah, so it looks like, wow, there were a lot more enslaved people.
That's true, there were. In terms of their
percentage to the
point of origin, yes. That's right, all the populations increased except for the Native Americans, which decreased dramatically.
That's why they had, when the Constitution was established, a black person was counted as 1/4 or
3/5 actually. Yeah.
3/5,
Right,
something
yeah.
like that. But,
Right.
rather than a full person in terms of.
Well, it was a fascinating political debate at that point. The southern states, which by then were increasing their slave population much faster, and the slavery was declining in the north, increasing in the south. By 1810, the South had over 1 million slaves already, and New York and the northern states peaked out at that 40,000 level that I showed you before, and went down after that. So the southern states wanted their slaves to be counted in their population for voting and representatives and the electoral college. We all learned about that again last couple of years. And so they cut a deal with the North, said, okay, you can have some credit, but not a full credit, because they're not really citizens. So they were credited with 3/4 of a person. And that's always been, I think in my mind, when I was younger, I always thought that was a real disgusting way to think about a person. It's only 3/5 of a person, right? Not a real person. But it was, New York slaves were 3/5 of a person too. It wasn't just people in South Carolina who were slaves who were counted that way. It was people here who were counted that way too. And in fact, we almost got another congressperson out of that deal in the beginning, because we had enough enslaved people counted at 3/5 of a person to almost make an additional person in Congress. So we're not innocent on that one either. Okay. So this is, I just want to wrap up by offering this list of resources for people who want to pursue any of these questions a little further. These are all the things that I've used here. And I think that one of the things that's been inspiring to me is I've first worked at the museum as a volunteer, learned to do some research there, and then elsewhere on my own, how much information there is available. Everybody kept records. Those papers of the bill of sale I showed you before, these records here, they're all out there to be found. And the John Jay New York Slavery Records Index I mentioned there, the next to the last one, is a relatively new, super easy online searchable index run by the John Jay College in New York City, part of the City University of New York. You go to that thing, you click on search, you type in the name of the person you think might be the slave owner or the person who was enslaved. Bingo, up they pop. Name, area, age of person, so on and so forth. The slave owners, the plats are all over that index because, of course, many of the plats who came here first to settle and found what we now know as Plattsburgh were in fact slave owners themselves, and others also. The Clinton County Historic Association has lots of stories on this and related topics that we're happy to share. The Underground Railroad Museum, I hope you all know about, is a fantastic resource. Let me just run a sec. And the one book I mentioned, In Defiance, and the other one is Secret Lives of the Underground Railroad in New York City, which is authored by Don Papsina, and his colleague Tom Calarco has a whole host of stories in it about the process and the people involved. And it's another great example of finding records that are sitting there to be found. We're in the library at Columbia University, is that right? And no one had ever found these journals before of the people who worked on the Underground Railroad and talked about helping people escape through New York City on up into Massachusetts or New York State. So there are tons of records available, and the center one, Adirondack History Center in E-Town, Margaret Bartley, who's here tonight, has just been working on compiling an index of all the people of color living in Essex County, the census records going back as far as she can find. And she's about to create a series of workshops to help people work with that data and become familiar with using it and understanding more about that county as well in this story. So, you want to start? Yeah?
I wondered about the correlation between the Underground Railroad going through the North Country and people in the North Country owning slaves. How did the two of them
Coexist?
Yeah.
Well, both are true, and both are true at the same time, although not as much, because the period of slavery decline, or the active slavery declined in this area toward the end of the 18th century, whereas the Underground Railroad activity didn't begin until 1820s. Is that fair to say, or even later?
Well, there were always people escaping, but what really helped the Underground Railroad was when England ended slavery in all of its territories on August the 1st, 1834. And the Americans knew that this was in the wind, and so that's when the anti-slavery movement started in the 1830s. So most of the Underground Railroad activity was between 1830 and then into the Civil War.
Right. So if as Don says, most of the Underground Railroad activity was from 1830 on, slavery having been officially ended in New York in 1827, it wouldn't have been together. On the other hand, some of the people who had been enslaved were still here. Some people, and we have records in the museum of people who lived in Plattsburgh, had been freed after a period of slavery. Some didn't make it out of slavery and so on. But there was, both things were going on, and there was, so people would have had experience with people in slavery and escapees at the same time. Yes?
Yeah, the New York State Legislature passed the freeing slaves in 1817 and take effect in 1827, but any minor children of slaves were not really freed. They were made indentured servants, and well into almost up to the Civil War, you still had these descendants of freed slaves that were not totally free in New York State.
That's right. We were one of the states that had this gradual emancipation thing going on, sponsored by John Jay, the governor, whose name is on the town down here, and whose family were slave owners themselves at one point. But he became an abolitionist and pushed the legislature into passing that gradual emancipation law. And you're right, there was a whole series of different freedom dates for people, and the young children were kept in bondage the longest because the owners wanted to have their service as long as they possibly could. And it was the same thing that happened all over the country.
Okay. One thing that's very interesting to me is that a number of people who were abolitionists were descended from slave owners. So John Jay's descendants became abolitionists and gave money and actually sheltered people, you know, at the home. And then in this area, Noadiah Moore's father was a slave owner, purchased a girl 5 years old when Noadiah was 5. Even John Keyes, the patriarch of the Quaker Keyeses here, was a slave owner and was disowned in Dutchess County because he refused to give a slave up. His descendants became abolitionists. Wendell Lansing was from a Dutch slaveholding family. He was an abolitionist Underground Railroad operative. So, and just down the road here, the old, where the barn is, where people were hidden, that property was originally owned by a slave owner.
Is that John Half?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then his son became an abolitionist, and he sold the property to Stephen Key Smith. So that's what I like to point out too, is that many of the people up here who became abolitionists weren't just thinking about the South. They knew this when they were growing up. They experienced this, and they knew it was wrong.
Well, they had, back in the 1830s, they had a major abolitionist meeting in Plattsburgh, and there was a riot, a major riot, and they drove the abolitionists out of the city, and they ended up holding their meeting at the old stone church at the Four Corners in Bigmantown.
Right, right.
And Thomas Treadwell, who was one of the major owners of property in this area, Treadwell Bay up here just north of Plattsburgh is named after him. But he was a major slave owner in the area.
The same thing happened to the first statewide convention of an abolitionist society they tried down in Utica with Garrett Smith, who later became very famous for a bunch of reasons. He was there, and they got thrown out of a church in downtown Utica by a mob, which came in and ejected them, led by the local congressman. And so they all rushed out for safety, and Garrett Smith said, "Come on to my place," which is in Peterborough, a little bit southwest of there. So they got on canal boats and then horses and wagons and went down to this little town of Peterborough, where now we could say is the foundation of the first abolitionist party in New York State, because they were driven out of Utica, this little town. They have an abolitionist hall of fame there. But same kind of thing. People were not necessarily happy with that kind of activity. Not everybody, despite the voting data I showed before, not everybody around here was in favor of abolition by any means. Yes?
Can I just share a little bit of...
Please do.
I'm Margaret Bartley from the Untitled History Museum. Peter's one of our great buddies. About a year ago, I got very frustrated with using the census data and coming across various black persons, or occasionally a person of color from Japan or China or Mexico or Native Americans. So instead of always trying to figure out, like, how did they get here and why are they here? I just decided to take a spreadsheet and start putting everybody who is not white on the spreadsheet, starting with the census of 1790. And I use Ancestry.com because that's available. That's the only resource I have that has original census records. So these census records are available from 1790 through 1940. So for Essex County, every person who is listed as a person of color, and in some cases people who have no race listed, but I know the family in a previous census was listed as a person of color, is on a spreadsheet database, which on June 28th we're having a workshop up in Lake Placid. We're inviting historians who want to share, like Peter's sharing and Don's sharing, to come, because we're going to make this entire database, which is now like, I don't know, 900 megabytes, available. I'm going to try to get it onto the Adirondack History Museum website, so that anybody who wants to do any research, this is there. You don't have to like try to track somebody through the rabbit maze. And in doing so, I've also found lots of stories about some of the people. And the amazing thing is, of course, Peru being a good example, we're right on the county line. So there were black families in Chesterfield, in Keysville, and then another census, they're over in Peru, or they're in Plattsburgh, and they come back and forth. So we have this challenge now. I need to challenge Clinton County people to do the same thing for their records. I've started it, folks. I've started gathering it. Yes. So the idea is to get it together in a similar format so that you're looking for somebody, oh, they're in Keysville, let's say, oh, here they are up here in Peru, or here they are over here in, on the lake someplace, because they did move around for work. And the other thing is the John Jay Slave Index only went up last February, I believe. And I was very excited about that. And I got a call from another researcher, some of you might know Amy Godine, and we were talking about it. She told me about the slave index, and that's slavery. I'm dealing with just people of color of any race, but the slave index is specifically for the slaves, so it does go back much earlier. And she says, I'm going crazy. There's all those slaves in Essex County in 1810. I can't find anything about any of them. And I went, there were no slaves in Essex County in 1810. There were none. There's hardly any people in Essex County in 1810. I mean, look at the mountains. At least you have the lake here. And she says, but the John Jay Index says there's like, I don't know, 30 or 40. And I went, no. And so what happens is, I actually called the John Jay School. And I talked to the professor who was in charge of this project. And I said, let me guess, you had a bunch of students gathering this data, didn't you? And she goes, yeah. And I said, so they were looking at the census records. She goes, yeah. And I said, well, in 1810, up until around 1850, they didn't give the census takers forms. They said, this is what you got to collect. You get your own paper, draw your lines on it, put these headings on it. So the census taker has a book, he had to buy his own book, put the lines on, put the headings on it, and the last column of all the free white men, women, other free persons, not white, and the last column was slaves, because slavery still existed in 1810. And they were supposed to just put a dash, 1, 2, 3, whatever, however many slaves were with that family. Joe Smith, wife, kids, slaves. There were no slaves. The census taker had this perfectly good column that was empty. So he drew a line through the word slaves at the top of the first page and wrote looms and cloth, because he was also supposed to collect information on manufacturing. So every time he went to a house and they had a loom, he put 1, 2, 1, 2. And when those nice young students at John Jay went down, they just counted every loom as a slave. They didn't know. It's the last column. It's supposed to be slaves. So I called them. I said, you need to look at the original record on the first page. At the top of the column, you will see slave, and then you will see loom and the yards of cloth. So that's where this database actually, they went, thank you so much. We knew there would be mistakes. So they're correcting that. So if you do come across this aberration, there were slaves here in 1790 in Essex County and in 1800, only a few. But by 1810 there were none. And this, when you mentioned the voting, that $250 worth of property, Garrett Smith gave property to black men so they could vote. The property they gave had to be worth that. And one man who got property from Garrett Smith in 1860 lived in this tiny hamlet of New Russia, south of Elizabethtown, and he voted. So blacks did vote if they had that land. And Janet here, our collections chair from the museum, came to me one day and she says, I found this voting ledger. I don't know what it is. And I'm looking at the family names going, oh my God, that's not suffrage. That's not the amendment, because it was about a suffrage amendment. But it's suffrage for black men. And Lafayette Mason, one of the recipients of Garrett Smith, his name is in there, and how he voted, there was no secret ballot. They voted, he voted yes to give male suffrage. It was defeated, but nevertheless, we actually have that voting record. So we have some pretty cool stuff at our museum. Come visit it.
Other questions?
Could you talk a little bit about North Elba and John Brown, and did it have a role in the Underground Railroad? And
well, John Brown, who of course was famous for other reasons, including Harper's Ferry, used to come to Elizabethtown, which is on that route that goes right up. Route 9, there's two valleys, the Boquet Valley and the El Sable Valley. And those were tended to be the two routes. Am I right, Don, that they're going up that way? I know also, Milo Duran lived in Elizabethtown, and his home was a station on the Underground Railroad. And Phineas Norton and Keene was on the El Sable Valley. And they both come out right up here, where the two kind of come together up here. Milo Duran, his house is still there. It's still in the Duran family. Milo Duran was a wanted man because he was helping slaves escape. And he was afraid to have his photograph taken. So, because he was wanted. And there was a bounty on their heads, not just the slaves, but the people running the Underground Railroad. And when he wouldn't let his picture be taken. So when he died, the family took a picture of him dead and then drew his eyes open. So the only picture of Milo Duran is of him dead with his eyes drawn open. And I got a copy of it from his great-great-granddaughter, because that's the only picture we had of great-great-granddad. And you can tell the eyes are drawn open. It's creepy. But Phineas Norton did have his picture taken. And they were both friends of John Brown, and John Brown used to visit them when he went back and forth.
And Brown, Garrett Smith created that, what they now call Timbuktu settlement out in North Elba for the reason of voting rights. He wanted to create an opportunity for people to get enough land to qualify to vote. And so that's the reason that that colony was established, for voting rights. And it did not succeed particularly. A number of people stayed and prospered and managed to hang on, but not a lot of them. But that was the whole idea. It wasn't to otherwise create a colony of free black people. And because Smith was the one who was sponsoring those referendums. He was putting money in something called the Liberty Party to try to create a political movement to spur abolitionist sentiment nationwide.
I'm going to stand too. I think people will hear better. What exactly do you want to know about?
No, I just, actually, I think it's Russell Banks is the author who wrote Cloud Split.
Yes, that's a...
And he has John Brown's son bringing slaves up through Indian Pass as part of the Underground Railroad and this whole dramatic thing.
I have the book, but I haven't read it.
Oh.
But maybe you know who this was. I heard that there was a historian who was very upset.
It's
not
a history book,
credible.
it's a novel.
It's a novel.
And
Okay.
some people say he takes liberties with the history.
Does he have people going from the Adirondacks to the lake?
It's up the valleys.
I forget that part of it. The part I remember is thinking he's bringing people up through Indian Pass,
Okay.
which itself is very arduous and
Right.
Okay, most of the traffic was by water. I've been doing this research since 2001, and last year was the first time I found a story and a name of someone who came by land from Maryland and went right on the old Post Road route, went all the way up to West Shazy and spoke in a Wesleyan church. So, I mean, this kind of research is never ending. But about John Brown, some late historians determined that none of the grantees had escaped from slavery. But we found that that's not true. And there are deeds in which the deed says that the person formerly a slave, and recently I'm doing research because I'm doing more research on the story we have in the museum on John Thomas, who was one of Garrett Smith's grantees in Franklin County. He escaped from Maryland. So I'm doing more research up in Franklin County, and I'm going deed by deed by deed, taking the grantee book and checking each one. Wow, what did I find a couple of weeks ago? James Beulah. James Beulah escaped from slavery. Then I found another deed, and James Beulah didn't go to Canada. He traveled with Reverend Abel Brown, who was the forwarding agent in Albany. He traveled up here and spoke in Plattsburgh. Then I found that he had two brothers, and they both escaped from slavery. Then I found another deed. Oh my gosh. Formerly in the pit of slavery. Then I'm looking at a book that's been written by Garrett Smith. That term, the terminology is used several times in the book. That's Garrett Smith's way of expressing his contempt of slavery. So we have to go like Margaret's doing, and Janet, you've got to find the primary original documents, and that will correct a lot of things. We don't, nobody can find anything in writing about John Brown helping people. So the historians in the past said that he didn't on the Underground Railroad. I never believed it. It wasn't, wherever he lived, he helped people. So that's all I wanted to say, but this is ongoing, so we're always looking for new information. My understanding is that people were sent from Chestertown. A couple of years ago, we did some investigating of a property in Scroon Lake, and there was a Reverend Baker. Supposedly he was helping people, and they were being sent to North Elba to John Brown. But so far we haven't found, for example, Milo Duran. A lot of people we don't Stephen Key Smith down the road. If they wrote anything down and anybody's name, we haven't found it yet. National Park Service wants names. They don't want an oral history. They want proof, you know, so.
It's easier to document.
Sometimes it shows up. You know, like you've made these discoveries. There's a lot of stuff out there. It just takes people who are passionate about this to find it.
Has there been anything showing up of any records of the slaves being forced or recruited into any of the military, like the War of 1812, being forced to fight or volunteer to fight in that war? Because out on Crab Island, we have there's a list out there. We put a plaque of all the Americans that are laying out there. And one name on there is a Diedrich Think, T-H-I-N-K. And I have never seen that name anywhere in the North Country.
Okay, Amy Godine sent me something years ago. She found a little article, I don't remember the man's name, a man who had been owned by Benjamin Moores and had been his servant during the War of 1812 and escaped. And he moved to Vermont. He is an old man in this article, and he tells that story. Stephen Key Smith, who lived down the road, said in his recollections that Benjamin Moore's slaves would run away and they would go to Grand Isle, to the Quakers on Grand Isle. So Amy found this little article with the name of somebody. So yes, there were black people who were made to be in the war because they were slaves. There's an ad of someone advertising to purchase a black servant during the War of 1812 in Plattsburgh.
Because that name, I have never seen it anywhere.
How do you spell it?
Think, T-H-I-N-K. Is his Diedrich is his first name. Okay. And I assume that this was either a slave that ran away, escaped or something and got on one of the ships, because he's on the island. He's actually buried on the island from Dr. James Mann's records. It would be under Commodore McDonough's command.
Well, there were some enslaved people who were in Plattsburgh during the battle, but there were also some free people, some free black people.
Yeah, and I was kind of wondering if possibly he just took the opportunity to, you know, volunteer, get on a ship, you know, and probably hope to free himself, or I don't know the story, but the odd name, you know, or I kind of think it's, you know, probably an escaped slave for that name, because it's one of the most uncommon names on the list, you know, of the entire North Country. You know,
well, maybe, but some of these people who were in the war were slaves.
Yes.
I mean, there were a lot of Southerners up here in the battles up here. Some big-time slave owners were up here. So, and they had servants.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, if you ever had, you know, so that answers my question.
And of course, the war creates all kinds of turmoil, and, you know, in the Revolutionary War, both sides, both the Americans and the British, were busy trying to recruit more people to their armies, and both sides offered freedom. In the South particularly, the British offered freedom to black people if they would join the British Army and fight against the revolutionaries. And there were black regiments in Connecticut for the Revolutionary War, for the American side as well, also with offers of freedom if things come out well. And then a whole bunch of people, I think it was from New York City, right, black people who signed up for the British Army during the Revolution were then helped to get to Nova Scotia after the war, because the Americans didn't want them around, as they were loyalist supporters of the British. And so they went up to the British colony in Nova Scotia. So there's a lot of that kind of turmoil going on, so it wouldn't be at all surprising for people to end up in one army or the other in that kind of circumstance.
I did find out on Ireland with William Gillibrand.
Mm-hmm.
I found a reference where Ireland escaped to Canada, and he was caught by some French-Canadian people who knew Gillibrand. I mean, there weren't a lot of people, so they kind of all knew each other. And the guy who caught him said, $6? You're going to pay me a heck of a lot more. You want this guy back. And held him because he wanted Gillibrand to pay him a lot of money to get this guy back. And I don't know if he ever did. I never heard that he came back. But that the Canadian just figured, hey, I'm not going to let him go for $6. Which, whatever that was in those days, wanted a lot more money.
We have some of that in the museum because Frank McKay is an excellent researcher in Canada, and he found that story. What he found was that this guy who Gillibrand owed money to went to the Governor General and said, I want you to arrest Ireland, and I want him sold so I can get my money that Gillibrand owes me. But Frank was never able to find out if that really happened. I really doubt that it did, so we don't know what happened in Ireland.
Well,
our meeting is Friday, June 28th, with night classes. If you're interested, I've got a couple cards here, or you can email them. Anybody wants to join.
Terminate this.
yes.
Were there slaveholders north and west of Plattsburgh?
There's slaveholders
Well,
north
like
and west.
McTown, Elba, Moores, Champlain, Clinton?
I don't know the answer to that. Do you?
I have that documentation, but I don't have it right here. Yeah. So there were in the town of Champlain and.
Yes.
Yes, in fact,
Plenty more was in
plenty more, right?
Yeah.
Plenty more. The town of Plattsburgh has its minute books, and in the minute books you can examine those. This is what Eddie has in her book, are all the records in the town of Plattsburgh. So you have the people who were enslaved. You have Thomas Treadwell as the first slave owner who freed people. You have people who are freeborn. You have people who are manumitted. Those are all in the town of Plattsburgh records. But yeah, there were.
Well, I'm kind of wondering, like, about the town of Clinton, where I grew up. You know.
I don't know of anybody in Clinton.
Well,
Definitely Beekman Town.
yeah.
But Plenty More was the one that had
Population, more money here.
two enslaved girls who became quilters and have a quilt in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. My wife told me she would ever talk one time about that.
I don't know about that.
Okay.
Peter?
Yes.
My math question, if from 1500 to 1800, 2.5 million Europeans came here, 12 million slaves came here. That's about a 5-to-1 ratio. How come the white people, how come the white people are a majority? That's
right. So as I indicated, that was that North and South America both. So
including the islands, and Jamaica, and all those.
That's right.
Haiti and all these other islands. So
right.
It wasn't wasn't just North America.
Correct. And the population, obviously, the growth in population in North America was much stronger among the white population than among the black because of the conditions they lived in, and they're easier for them to propagate, raise families, and so on.
Any more questions?
Thank you.
More
Thank
questions?
you.
Thank you.
There you have it. Peter Slocum, and the history of slavery in the North Country. Thanks for watching viewer-supported Hometown Cable TV. We think is worthy of your support. Hometown Cable.